reduced carbon, resource efficiency, and resilience. And those are really the three things that we target on every data center development. So reduced carbon, how do we get as much renewable energy into the data centers as possible? How are we ensuring that we're offering customers and tenants a renewable option? And then resource efficiency, always designing to the top tier PUE in that market. And then last point is resilience. At Epoch Digital, we're thinking about both climate resilience. We've seen typhoons hit Taiwan during our construction phase, and thankfully our design was pretty resilient, but that's not something we're complacent about.
Hello and welcome to Cool Vector. I'm David Snow, your host, and today we're joined by Thomas Liu and James Magor, both of Actis. Actis is, of course, a global private equity firm with a specialty in sustainable infrastructure. Very interestingly, Actis was recently acquired and became part of another very large private equity firm, General Atlantic. So Thomas and James, thank you so much for being on Cool Vector, and I'm really looking forward to speaking to both of you. Why don't we start with, and maybe the first question can go to Thomas. A very interesting thing about the digital infrastructure data center asset class opportunity is that it involves many different disciplines and many different industries: real estate, energy, technology, and that's just a few. Thomas, can you talk about how Actis has sort of set up its team with the right mix of skills and sort of industry focuses to really tackle the global data center opportunity?
If you look at Actis, we have, I would say, three verticals, right, of investment teams. One is very specialized in renewable energy. We're probably one of the largest investor and developers of renewable assets globally. And then the second vertical is just general infrastructure. There's investments in general infrastructures, multiple sectors, infrastructure funds. And then the third one is in real estate, right? So we have a real estate specialist. We're focusing on buying land, developing greenfield projects across many parts of Asia. So if you look at data center as an asset class, it's really a combination of all three. The land and the building itself, getting approval, getting land is really fundamentally what the real estate investor does, and we've been doing all along. But then if it's just focusing on that, then the next part of the data center, which is all the critical infrastructure, the mechanical engineering, electrical, and the plumbing parts of the building, which is actually 80% of the total cost of building a data center. That really comes down to really understanding of how to develop and deliver something that could be resilient, right? That's 24/7, 365 nonstop type of infrastructure product. And then on top of that, once you complete the building, the operational side of it is very much an infrastructure play because this is, again, you have very strict service level agreement with the users, particularly when you're dealing with the largest hyperscalers. Unlike a real estate guy, when we're just leasing offices to people, there is a certain level of service they expect. But if the power is down for a couple of hours, people probably wouldn't mind that much. Whereas the data center, it's a very, very big consequence. So that, again, is an infrastructure kind of mindsets. More recently, especially with AI, I think we have always looked at it because of the high power usage of data center. Even when we start looking at data center, we have always been thinking about how we use the knowledge that we have in renewable energies to combine with our data center, particularly with AI. There's really huge focus by all the hyperscale customers and everyone knowing that data center now all of a sudden the power, the hockey stick just go even steeper, right, for the power consumption. Every project we look at, we from day one start to bring in our team in the renewable energy to start thinking about how we can combine the three, combine them into the offering. So even though the three seems to be operating independently, when we look at projects, we just bring in teams and people with expertise in different sectors to come in for a data center project.
James, we're going to talk about your role and sort of the role that sustainability plays in the Actis strategy and in digital infrastructure broadly. But can you talk about sort of what you do and what the importance of sustainability is to the digital infrastructure opportunity?
I sit in a central team called the sustainability team. We work with Thomas and also all of the other Actis asset classes on creating value through sustainability leadership. And the digital infrastructure sector is particularly critical for us. There's been a lot of media, I guess, which is partly why we're talking about the negatives of the digital revolution, the power consumption and a number of other things which we shouldn't gloss over, and I'm sure we'll talk about. But it's also important to recognize and maximize all of the positives, both climate and social impact positives that come from digital access. So my team and myself work with our digital companies, making sure we're managing energy supply, energy efficiency, water efficiency, and then seeking to maximize all of the positives that come from access to digital infrastructure.
And of course, in a bit, we're going to learn about sort of how sustainable these assets can be and what some of the innovations are in sustainability as a result of the huge amount of capital and interest coming into digital infrastructure. But why don't we start with sort of the global demand? Certainly, your team follows the demand behind the need for so many data centers and digital infrastructure to be built around the world. Help us as investors understand what the data consumption is, especially in growth markets where Actis is active. What do you look at as far as data consumption, and what does that tell you about the opportunity to invest in digital infrastructure?
The markets first developed, clearly it's on the developed market, but I think there's a couple of things that have happened as this infrastructure proliferates to the rest of the world, and particularly in developing part of the world. And one is that the power consumptions really, if you look at in Asia, they started off in cities like Tokyo and Singapore, and in Europe you have Dublin and London and Frankfurt. And what's happened is all these very highly populated cities just running out of power. And the growth rates of these hyperscalers, if you let them, they'll continue to take up more and more the power that these places offer. So I think that is a push factor to push them out of the developed market into places where power is available. So that's a push factor. But there's also a pull factor, and that's data sovereignty, right? And so when you look at Asia, again, it all started with Singapore being a regional hub of all the hyperscalers, and they were very happy to be based there and serve all their customers across Southeast Asia, including even India. But not just because Singapore now has a moratorium with power, the data sovereignty is increasingly being enforced by all the other Southeast Asian nations in saying if you want to serve customers within the country, especially if governments start signing up to these cloud services, then they have to make sure that data are hosted and is being processed onshore. And so both this push and pull factor is bringing the demand by hyperscalers into these more developing parts of the world.
James, when a data center is built in partnership with Actis, how sustainable does its energy consumption need to be at the outset? Are you looking for 100% sustainability sort of as soon as the lights go on, or is there more of a gradual approach?
When we look at our data center investment opportunities, we're starting, certainly in Asia, right at the beginning. So what are we looking to build? We're underwriting green certification, first of all. We're looking at conducting sustainability opportunities analysis on every design. So how can we ensure that we're designing and building and operating data centers that are as energy efficient as possible with the lowest or top tier power usage effectiveness in that market, PUE. We're looking at water efficiency as well, trying to maximize that. And we're looking to try and reduce embodied carbon. Then there are other aspects that we build in. Energy supply is critical. Are we operating in a market where renewable energy will become available either through direct PPAs or through purchasing of IREX? And then we're looking at further down the line at aspects like physical climate risk as well. And can this data center be aligned with net zero? So there's a whole package of measures that we pull together. And by considering each one systematically on every data center development, that's what we mean by developing sustainable data centers.
Can you sort of say for the record that whether or not, the institutional investors, the large family offices that are primarily Actis's investors, they care about sustainability, that this is a mandate that Actis is in lockstep with its investors?
My team spent a lot of time talking to Actis's institutional investors all around the world about what we do. So first thing, the level of interest from our investors is really high. And then there's a consideration of whether it's actually critical for their investment decision making. And we've seen a huge increase in the last couple of years. Like Deloitte published a study only recently to show how critical sustainability has become to investment decision making. So, yeah, it's not a universal picture, but the trend is going in one direction, and that's up.
We get asked that questions by all of our investors almost every time we have gatherings with them. So it's very, very high on the mind of many of them. Now, there are two aspects of this. There are the aspects of whether this asset sale is sustainable, obviously something Actis cares all about in all the investment we do. But at the same time, when it comes to data center, it's also make business sense to do it, because if you look at all of the key customers that we're serving, which are the hyperscalers, they all have set very aggressive net zero goals, anywhere between 2030 to 2040, much earlier than some of the 2050 goals most people have set. And so for them, it becomes essential for the data center they use to be sustainable. They understand not every data center can access green power, but when you can't, you still want to see a path towards that country's green grid becomes more and more green, how we can access that energy for them. And there's no one better than Actis to be able to do that, given our credentials in renewable energy sectors. And so I think that's something we bring to the table. And frankly, this is what we also call future-proofing the assets, right? As an investor, we are not only thinking about what we're building now, but we're actually thinking when we have to sell these assets 3, 4, 5 years from now, the buyer coming in needs to make sure that asset is sustainable for the next 10 to 15 years. And that's when sustainable becomes absolutely essential, right? So we need to forward thinking and take that into account.
Okay, let's talk about the Actis opportunity around the world in digital infrastructure. What are you looking for, and what kinds of opportunities do you find yourself spending the most time on these days?
I'll touch on data center first, but there are great opportunities also in the other infrastructure, such as towers and fiber optics, because the three is actually all interlinked, right? Processes stored in the data center and transmitted through fibers and through towers. As more and more of us, especially in the developing part of the world, more people are using mobile. So all three sectors have great opportunities, especially when we see assets developed by the incumbent telcos increasingly being carved out because they need to focus on the core services. They really don't need to be assets owner. So Actis in the last few years have already done various transactions in these carve-outs opportunities of towers and fiber optics in our parts of the world. That's a theme that will continue to play out, and as more and more of these developing markets go through that trend that follows what has happened already in the developed world in carving out these assets. So we see a lot of opportunities in this in the next really like a 10-year trend to do that. And then when it comes to data center, we see that as actually a great opportunities, because in a developed market, there are many players, right? There are many state data center providers and operators. There's no doubt huge demand in market like the US or in Tokyo. Pretty much everything got built, are being taken up right now, particularly AI. But when you're in a market where you're just one of many providers, and frankly, the one dynamic with data center is globally, there are only 5 customers that anyone's talking to. And so inevitably, when that happens, it comes down to price. But then what we see is when the hyperscaler starts to grow into our parts of the world, so if you look at the markets we're in, for example, Seoul, now it's a relatively mature market already, but it's only about 7 years old for the hyperscalers. So we're in the markets, when we started doing this 4 years ago, we became really a solution providers for the hyperscalers, right? We're the first one that are designing data centers, particularly for hyperscalers, so they're not just using these old telco data centers. And same thing we're doing, we're looking for markets in Asia, in other parts of the world where we can do the same thing. And especially when the hyperscaler is coming into a new market, developing market, it's not so easy for a new player to come in and buy land and get approval and then develop, and has a track record of actually developing something in these markets. Then I think the Actis track record of developing both real estate and infrastructure in these markets gives the hyperscalers the confidence that when we say we can build it, we will do it for them. And so we become a real partner in that sense, and one of the few providers in these markets. And so that's where we see the best opportunity for Actis.
I'm glad you mentioned the complexity of regulations, permitting, things like that. Given that Actis is active in many different countries around the world, what is your approach like to just managing the various different regulatory regimes that you need to be expert in order to get these projects done?
It really comes down to experience. I think every market's different. Every market has its own regulatory regime. But when it comes down to it, it's a real estate project. It's the same approval, right? It's the same getting the land, getting the planning approval, understanding the local zoning rules, understanding what are the particular issues that the regulator or the local planning board cares about when they approve a projects. And so how a project is approved in India, it's very different from how it's done in Korea. And so for someone that haven't done the project, even in the more mature markets like Korea, someone that has never done anything can land in Seoul and then find themselves a nice piece of land and then realize that this piece of land have some peculiarity to it and could never get approval. So I think it really just comes down to having team on the ground who have done it before and understand that, right? So it's really not the expertise, but just knowing first and foremost what to avoid, and what are the issues that we need to be mindful of even before we bought the land, that we know that this land may or may never get approval for a data center for some local reasons.
Quick follow-up question. Is there a form of rule, regulation, or permitting process that has the greatest variance from country to country? Maybe perhaps is a wild card. Is it the energy regulatory process? Does it have to do with foreign ownership? Does any particular type of rule stand out?
No, I wouldn't say in any particular rule. I think, in markets like, China and Vietnam, for example, there's very special licensing rules for any foreigners who want to operate data center. It's not granted to wholly owned foreign companies. And so that's one barrier. In China, there's a special quota you need to get for power, and that doesn't exist anywhere else. In Korea, if you have a data center land that's next to local communities, you get a lot of protests because for communities seems to, in Korea, particularly think that the electromagnetic field is harmful to health. And so a lot of projects not getting approved. So I think every market is really different.
James, a related question. We know that governments are typically bullish on digital infrastructure because they would like their nation to become a digital hub and they see benefits to that. How would you characterize the level of enthusiasm for sustainability among governments in these growth markets?
Look, firstly, when you look at sustainability globally, 80% of the SDG, Sustainability Development Goals targets, rely on digital infrastructure or the digital technology that is underpinned by digital infrastructure in order to achieve those targets. So when you think about governments providing access to their citizens to online healthcare, to online education, to online banking services, building out the digital infrastructure to provide that, and also having the data sovereignty so that your healthcare records, your banking records, and education records are stored within the country where the citizens live is a really critical consideration. As a global growth markets investor, we think about how our investments are supporting SDGs, and then we think about the role that the infrastructure plays in developing those economies. Now, that's sort of on the social side of sustainability. On the environmental side, I'll quickly cover the benefits, but of course then there are local challenges as well. When we think about the broader role of digital technology, yes, we worry about the power consumption, but equally, digital technology is actually vital for integrating renewable power into electricity grids, right? You have distributed and intermittent power sources being integrated into very complex electricity networks that were designed for building generation capacity next to the point of demand. And now that's changed with the growth of wind and solar. So yes, digital is drawing a lot of power, but it's also the solution to integrating renewable power into grids. So that's something that also has to be considered as part of the equation. Now, locally, Thomas has touched on this. We've seen in Singapore, we've seen in Ireland, real local concern about the huge power consumption that is coming from data centers and the growth of AI that is also driving that demand. So there you are seeing things like the Johor Bahru campus emerging in Malaysia to serve Singapore. Now, the Singaporean government is concerned about the demand, and the Malaysian government sees it as a fantastic investment opportunity to grow the industry in the country. So like a lot of these conundrums, there's positives and negatives that we're always weighing up. What we think about is this infrastructure providing solutions to sustainability challenges? And that's what we try to do through our investments.
Excellent. Why don't we move to a bit of a case study? Actis has invested in a platform called Epoch Digital. It was established in 2022, and there are projects in Taiwan, Malaysia, and South Korea. What can you tell us about this project and the similarities between those projects and what perhaps ties them together thematically?
Well, all three are relatively new markets. I think that's the commonality. I think even when it comes to Asia, Seoul's probably the longest one. As I said, Hyperscaler started going in there about 8 years ago. I would say the two that's really share the commonality is between Seoul and Taipei. And these are markets where hyperscalers are relatively new. In fact, Taipei, Amazon just announced this is a new region this year, right? Everyone knew that they were planning on it. This is how we see the opportunities. We want to be there early. We want to be a solution provider as they enter a new market. And if all the evidence we have seen in other markets, as they enter, they could start with a modest demand, but the demand will inevitably grow over time. And so as a new partner to the hyperscalers as they enter a market, we will then continue to grow with them into these markets since we have built a track record of delivering. So if you look at Seoul, for example, under this platform, this project that we're doing now is actually our third assets by Actis in Seoul already. We've already done 2 since 2020, and we've now fully delivered on those 2 assets for the hyperscalers. So that's the continuous theme that we seek to do, is to find these new markets where we can do that. In Malaysia, Johor is a little bit different. As James said, this is a market that's right adjacent to Singapore. And since 2019, Singapore announced a moratorium because of power shortage to develop new data center. And so everyone has been looking at neighboring regions already to start thinking about where should this be developed. And Johor in the last 2 years, really, maybe 2-3 years, has gone from 0 to now over gigawatts of power announced. And so again, this is the attraction of a brand new market. If you understand the dynamic of industry and you can be there early, then you capture that growth as these new markets. So that's really I think, similar characteristic as we've been working on these new markets, for the last few years, and we continue to look for that as these hyperscales. Next, we'll be looking in. They already have planned to go into other Southeast Asian markets, and they will continue to look at even in mature markets like Japan, to start to look at places beyond just Tokyo and Osaka, and look at other regions as well.
James, what would you describe as the sustainability highlights of Epoch Digital that you can tell us about?
I think the highlight for the platform is the fact that sustainability is strategically integrated into all of its decision-making going forward. And I'll give you an example of how we're thinking about this. We talk about at Epoch Digital the 3 R's strategy. So reduced carbon, resource efficiency, and resilience. And those are really the 3 things that we target on every data center development. So reduced carbon, how do we get as much renewable energy into the data centers as possible? How are we ensuring that we're offering customers and tenants a renewable option? In many markets like Taiwan, that's through renewable energy certificates. And they have their own regime in Taiwan, which is quite different from the rest of the world. But we're seeking to maximize the renewable energy options to our tenants there. In Malaysia, we have a renewable energy platform in our energy business, which is guiding the team there on how to access renewable power for that data center. And then we're exploring the same opportunities in Korea. And then resource efficiency, always designing to the top tier PUE in that market, and also to the extent possible, maximizing the water efficiency. And at times there's a little bit of a trade-off between energy efficiency and water efficiency. So we take into account the local challenges and making sure we're balancing it in the right way. And then last point is resilience. At Epoch Digital, we're thinking about both climate resilience. We've seen typhoons hit Taiwan during our construction phase, and thankfully our design was pretty resilient, but that's not something we're complacent about. We know the climate is changing, weather events are becoming more severe, so we're trying to build and design for the most resilient data centers we can. And then just my last point, there's a social element to resilience as well. In these really competitive markets, attracting and retaining the most talented people is critical for building a resilient platform and resilient business. So we really think about equity and inclusion and diversity when we're building management teams to make sure we have a solid, reliable, resilient team that can execute on the strategy for the long term. It's a really exciting platform.
Real quick follow-up question before we move on. You mentioned that there's sometimes resistance to new projects because the locals perceive that having a data center near their community is somehow bad for their health. When you are confronted with this concept of a data center being not a good thing to live around, what do you say?
Yeah, look, we've had concerns raised, as Thomas mentioned earlier, about electromagnetic field impacting citizens. There is just a fundamental challenge, actually, with data centers. If you see a piece of urban land and someone's building a data center there, there's a perception that you're not deriving any real benefits from that. It's a box when it could be a shopping mall or a cinema or something, that people feel they derive a more immediate benefit from, rather than understanding the role in the broader digital ecosystem. So what we've looked at around the world is providing digital skills training to local people to try and just build up that engagement between the host community and the data center itself. We've done that very successfully in Nigeria, and we're looking at other markets like Korea. It's going to be a slightly different program in Korea to Nigeria, but digital literacy, digital training, being able to participate in the digital ecosystem is something that we're seeking to promote, that just helps mitigate some of that tension between host community and data center, as well as just being open for awareness and education and explaining what it does and doesn't do.
Let's talk about the fact that Actis is a global platform that you are investing in digital infrastructure around the world, particularly in growth markets. What are the benefits of having that global scale? Is the sum of the parts greater because there are some synergies that are unlocked because of this global network?
The key characteristic of data center industry is that, which is very different from the other infrastructure sector, is that you're serving the same customers wherever you are. Right? There again, there's 5 U.S. names, and then there may be a couple of Chinese names. And they are global companies, and they need to be served wherever they are. And they look for partners that they can work with them in multiple jurisdictions. Now, there are certainly the global platforms in the U.S. that's going out, but then in newer markets, they need to find partners that are proven, that can deliver for them and operate for them in these markets. So for us to have a global footprint across our markets, to showcase, to illustrate to the hyperscalers that we can build for you in Taiwan, in Seoul, in Malaysia, and then later we have something in LATAM, in Africa, in Middle East, in Eastern Europe. These are markets that shows that, and we deliver the same consistency and quality in the finishing, the fit out, the mechanical parts, and the operational side. That becomes a very valuable brand name that Actis can bring to the table when we've continued to build out our businesses across the regions.
We're a global digital player, and we're a global renewable energy player. And it's so helpful when you're developing in Korea to go and talk to our Korean renewable energy business. When you're developing in Malaysia, go and talk to our local renewable energy business there. When you're operating data centers in Brazil, we have our renewable energy business in Brazil that can provide clean power to the data center. So marrying up those two footprints, there's a lot of synergies and benefits to derive from that.
It seems that the supply of things necessary for data centers is in very high demand and perhaps quite scarce. Energy, perhaps the labor to build these properties. What seems like it's not that hard to come across is the demand from the hyperscaler customers. At this stage in the development of digital infrastructure, is it sort of a foregone conclusion that if you build data centers somewhere, the large hyperscalers will want to use it?
I think the market has certainly changed given in the last 2 years because of AI. And so I think previously, pre-ChatGPT, the AI era, data center were built for cloud services. And when it comes to cloud services, there are specific locations, specific clusters. There's some very strict architecture that the hyperscalers stick to. So if you're building data center outside of those clusters, then it becomes very hard for them to come to you, or you may have to wait a long time before they come to you. So that's a dynamic. But I think with AI, what has happened is just the demand just exploded in the last 2 years. And so all the supply that was not planned for AI, only for the cloud services, got fully taken up. Now, while everything has been taken up in the last 2 years, I think especially in the developed market like the US, I would still caution that any new any new investors thinking of doing data center still need to be mindful of locations and the site selection criteria that many of these hyperscalers have. And so even in Asia, when Singapore announced a moratorium in 2019, there was Johor is now proven that it is the big market that this spillover. But there are actually a couple other candidates that was in the race. So Batam, which is an island, Indonesian island just across from the strait from Singapore, have been built up, and there are investors there that bought land and plan to build data center. As Johor built out, I think now the demand will spill over, but that becomes a market that will take some time before it matures. So I think there are still criteria that need to be thinking about. There needs to be continuous engagement with the customer to understand what's suitable for them, what's important to them, and so which location would be more likely to be picked by them in the next 1 or 2 years instead of the next 4 or 5 years. Because as a fund, as an investor, you don't want to sit on the land for that long.
Let's touch briefly on wireless towers. Obviously, that's an important component of the digital infrastructure asset class. What is Actis seeing as far as wireless tower opportunities around the world, and how do those opportunities differ, I guess, by way of complexity or transaction sourcing from data centers?
The play is the same around the world, and I think as it was in the US and Western Europe, now it's going to other parts of the world. It's really carved out of assets. Towers are always originally started built by the telcos themselves, and it's built for their own use. So all the mobile network operators would have their own towers. And then eventually, because they have to invest so much into new infrastructure, new services, owning the asset itself really doesn't help them. And so then they start to carve out these assets and selling them to professional asset owners. So the benefits there, again, the playbook is the same. These towers, when they're carved out, is used by one single operators. But once you become independent asset owners, the same towers, you can accommodate the broadcast by several operators. So basically, you start leasing it to more than one operators, and you increase, they call the occupancies, right, of the towers. So that business model is the same everywhere you go. But as this has been fully paid out in the mature market, it's gradually, as new developing market, they have to change the regulations. They have to change some of the telcos, and some of the markets either have too many operators or too little, or the market's going through some consolidations. It takes both a regulation change as well as a local market dynamic to get to a point where it makes sense for telcos to carve out these assets to independent owners. So this is being played out in Asia, for example. In Southeast Asia particularly, it started off with Indonesia. So that carve-out has pretty much been fully played out. The major operators have spun out most of their tower assets already. And then over the last 3 years, I would say it's been Philippines. And so this will then move on from markets to markets. So we do see that trend continuing. One of our partners in Brazil had done 2 of tower codes already as a CEO of different tower codes in Brazil. But then we're still seeing with his expertise to work on other tower carve-out deals across our footprints, not just in LATAM, but last year we did a transaction in Eastern Europe, also carve-out. So this trend is global. The business model is very similar. And so the business model that you can replicate, and with someone with knowledge of how to execute these things, we can replicate that business models across our footprints.
James, my guess is that wireless towers have a slightly different profile than data centers by way of sustainability. Don't use any water. Do they use less energy? How would you describe the profile of these assets as far as the ability to make them net zero?
When we look at towers, we also do fiber to home and fiber to business networks as well. We had a great investment in South Africa in that sector. The environmental footprint is pretty small in this sector. One of the things we really like about both towers and fiber is the ability to penetrate into underserved communities. So when we think about the role of towers providing connectivity and access to rural areas, in some of our countries, they play a really vital role in connecting rural communities to the broader digital networks. And then with our fiber business, one of the really successful elements of that was the growth into lower income areas by providing prepaid digital connectivity, which allowed the unbanked to connect for the first time. And this was a really fantastic social aspect of both of these. The environmental footprint is small and the social benefits are enormous.
Let's talk about the fact that Actis recently became part of General Atlantic. How do you expect that joining up will benefit the investment activities of Actis? What resources or what expertise can you now draw on from General Atlantic, if any?
Yeah, that's a good question. I would think there are two aspects. I think one on the asset management aspect, I think certainly I think Actis and GA, we have been serving different pool of investors, right? So just by pulling the two together, both of us have a much larger pool of investors that we face. That's one side of it. But I think on the investment side, I think one aspect that really helped us as we look at particularly digital infrastructure is that General Atlantic, as a growth equity firm, have invested in some of the larger, internet and TMT companies. And so through those investments, and for working with them, we now get to know a lot more about the customers that we're serving in the infrastructure we're building, how they're thinking about it, what is their plan, and how do we then really serve them better. And that's the knowledge I think we can gain from working with our General Atlantic colleagues.
Is there appetite among Actis's limited partners for co-investment?
Short answer is yes. I think in asset management, I think private equity co-investment is becoming more and more prevalent. And that's driven by, I think, again, pull and push factor. The pull factor is certainly, so LPs are asking for more and more co-invest.
Excellent. Well, Thomas Liu and James Magor of Actis, thank you so much for joining Cool Vector today. And I hope I can have you both back in the future to hear about what you're seeing in the world of digital infrastructure.